Honorable Marvin Gonzales, Minister of Public Utilities. I welcome as well, as I introduce you to, the various heads of some of the arms of national security, the Commissioner of Police and Deputy Commissioner Earl Christopher, of course, the Chief of Defense Staff, and we have as well officials of T&TEC, and I have with me here as well the permanent secretaries of the Ministry of National Security. On behalf of all of us, we welcome you to this press interface. The last 24 hours in Trinidad and Tobago were in some ways historic, and we emerged from them somewhere around 1:30 or so, those events this morning. So in this regard, we believe, as the government of Trinidad and Tobago, that we are obliged, we are obligated to the people of Trinidad and Tobago to render to you our perspective on what transpired and to answer any concerns that you may have. And we are, as I said, well prepared to do that, because we have here the Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister and, of course, the Minister of Public Utilities and the other officials. We, therefore, take note of some of the expressions of concern that came by way of the media, formal media, and, of course, social media, and the Minister of Public Utilities would be able to provide, along with his people on T&TEC, a very clear explanation for what transpired, and then you will hear from the others, because it had its genesis in the question of power distribution, and then as night fell, it had greater implications for national security. It carried inside of there, in our professional assessment, the potential for severe disorder, and therefore we at National Security acted in certain ways which I dare say preempted or averted a lot of that for which there was potential. So I would like to make way. I would like to invite my colleagues to indicate perspectives on this matter, and I invite Minister Young from the Office of the Prime Minister in this regard.
Thank you very much, Minister Hinds, Minister Gonzales, all heads of security, members of the media, wider viewing and listening public of Trinidad and Tobago. As Minister Hinds introduced me, I'm here today really wearing the cap of Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister. And just to give the public some information, when the Minister Gonzales and T&TEC will give us the technical side, but when just after midday yesterday, close to 1 o'clock, the whole island of Trinidad lost electricity, I want to give the public the assurance that throughout that whole episode until about 1:30 this morning, at all points in time, the Honorable Prime Minister was kept informed by National Security, Public Utilities and others at all points in time. The National Security Council was well informed and participating in the information that was coming. As Minister of Energy, I was getting information from the bodies that fell under the Ministry of Energy. I was in constant contact with my colleagues, Minister Hinds and Minister Gonzales. And then fast forward to this morning, immediately this morning, the Honorable Prime Minister called a meeting of the National Security Council and the various heads who are here with us today for a briefing and an update, but he had already been provided with that, but more so an analysis of what had happened and what needs to happen now, and I'll get into that towards the end. So it is just to let you all know that at all points in time, the government was involved. A very pertinent decision was taken early o'clock, and Minister Gonzales was given the point person role of communicating with the public, and smartly we decided that T&TEC, being the body that provides the electricity transmission to Trinidad and Tobago, would put out the releases. Of course, you all would understand it was a very fluid situation. So we could not pinpoint an exact point in time when the whole island would be returned to service. I'd like to thank all of the workers who provided the service that they did on both the public utilities side throughout, as well as the national security side, on behalf of National Security Council and the Prime Minister. And I will come in at the end just to tell you all some of the discussions and decisions we had at the National Security Office, at National Security Council, and out of the office of the Prime Minister. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Hinds and my cabinet colleagues, Minister Young. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, permanent secretaries, as well as Mr. Ramsook, General Manager of T&TEC, and all of the senior officials of T&TEC present here. As we know, yesterday was a very challenging day for us in the utility sector, when at 12:52 p.m. a major disruption occurred on T&TEC's distribution and transmission system, where two main transmission lines from Gandhi Village to Union Estate came into contact with a 12 kilovolt line as a result of that disruption, and it caused a major trip on the distribution system around Trinidad and Tobago, causing all of the machines and plants at TGU to go out of operation. As a result of that major disruption at TGU, the other standby measures that we had in place from Trinity and PowerGen did not provide the level of sustainability and vulnerability to the distribution system in Trinidad and Tobago, causing all of the machines and the plants to go down. I will not go into the technical details because that is the reason why we have Mr. Ramsook, the General Manager of T&TEC, as well as his senior officials who will go into further details. Safe to say that I spent about 5 hours at T&TEC's main control room at Mount Hope yesterday evening. I left there almost 1 a.m. this morning, and I must say that I feel gratified that the level of professionalism that I have witnessed from the senior engineers at T&TEC, led by Mr. Ramsook and his team. I think we in Trinidad and Tobago, despite the challenges that we faced yesterday as a country, we should feel proud that we have a cadre of citizens who are concerned about Trinidad and Tobago and the welfare of Trinidad and Tobago, and will go out of their way to ensure that in the event of an emergency and in the event of a great challenge as presented itself yesterday, that they will go out of their way to restore stability to Trinidad and Tobago. And it is because of their hard work and because of the collaboration that they had with the independent power producers, Trinity, PowerGen, as well as TGU, despite the slow pace at which power was restored to the grid across Trinidad. I think the team at T&TEC ought to be congratulated for their hard work, and I wish to also register my profound gratitude and my sense of feeling very proud for the kind of work that they have demonstrated yesterday. I will ask Mr. Ramsook to go into details, but I will make it abundantly clear that the standby system and the measures that we have put in place to ensure that there is redundancy and to ensure that what transpired yesterday ought not to have happened, that system did not trigger and it did not come into effect, and therefore we will look deeper into what transpired. T&TEC will conduct its own investigation, and Minister Young will let you know what is the decision of the government moving forward. Mr. Ramsook? Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Honorable Minister Gonzales, Minister Hinds, and Minister Young. So, my name is Kelvin Ramsook, General Manager at T&TEC. So, as the Minister rightly said, at 12:52 p.m. yesterday, the Commission experienced a catastrophic failure of its supply via a fault that developed on two of its major circuits, which is the Union Gandhi number 1 and number 2 circuit. The way the generation is configured, the Gandhi, the TGU power station was doing 500 megawatts, roughly 500 megawatts of a load, a total load demand on the system of 1185 megawatts. So you would have had roughly 40% of the capacity coming from TGU. The fault occurred at a particular location on the south section of the country. Our systems are so designed that if a fault occurs, especially on the transmission grid, we can detect that from our control center in terms of the location, the distance of the fault on the grid. That location was clearly identified via our systems internally, and we dispatched personnel from the commission to the site to identify and to double-check the location where we suspected the fault had occurred. Upon our arrival on the site, we did analyze the situation, discovered what transpired. While that matter is still being investigated, at that time, which would have been roughly 1 p.m., between 1 and 1:30, we were able to identify that the site was safe and we were in a position to restore supply to the country. At the time of the fault, because of the nature of the fault, that the Union Gandhi number 1 and 2 line, which is one of the major lines in this country, supplied from the TGU power station, which provides the highest capacity right now on the grid, one of the highest capacity on the grid. At the time of the fault, because the lines, the 2 lines, which is the transport lines, were impacted, those lines failed, and of course, you then had a disconnect from the TGU power station. We have what you call an under-frequency scheme that will operate. The main issue here is that when that happens, because the remaining power stations are unable to carry or to carry the rest of the load, because the load on the system was 1185, because it was unable to carry the rest of the load, the requirement was to shed that load as quickly as possible. During the process of shedding the loads, the other power stations are also grabbing the load. So you have a combination of the two. The other power station, which is power gen, as well as Trinity, is also grabbing the load to compensate for TGU that has now lost the load on the grid because of the two main transmission lines. Unfortunately, the under-frequency, the way the operation took place, the other power stations ended up going into a shutdown mode simply because we couldn't, the system didn't, in terms of the under-frequency scheme and the timing, did not take off the load in terms of the appropriate time. And of course, when these things happen, you have to analyze. It depends on the fault condition. It depends on the level of the fault because, as I said, you have the two entities competing there. One trying to take off the load, the power stations trying to grab the load. That caused the catastrophic failure that caused the entire island of Trinidad to lose power. That occurred at 12:52. When that occurred, as I said, we dispatched our personnel to the particular site, and we identified that we could have restored service, and immediately upon that timing, which would be between 1 and 1:30, we notified all the independent power producers that we are ready for you to come on the grid. So we're dealing with two situations. One, a faulted condition, a quick detection of the fault, and the phase 2 is to get capacity back onto the grid. So we were ready to get capacity, all the capacity back onto the grid at 1:30. That proved a significant challenge for us. Now remember, you don't have, you would have, and I'm sure you would have, the media would have recognized that we had 1 or 2 outages in the past. First of all, I should have done this earlier, forgive me for this. Let me apologize to all the customers of Trinidad and Tobago. T&TEC sincerely apologize. I saw the inconvenience myself, and to all the customers of Trinidad and Tobago because of this situation, we sincerely apologize. And of course, we will have a discussion of what our future action plans are. coming back to the point, so we did in fact go to phase 2 to try to get all the independent power producers to come on the grid. Now, as I explained before, you would have had situations where you would have had sections of the grid being affected. When that happens, the grid still has power. So the other unaffected sections can help out the affected sections. That's how the system grid generally works. Once you have a total shutdown, it means everybody's off. And everybody has to try to come on now. And remember, you can't practice that. Because at total shutdown, you don't want to practice because that means everybody goes out. When that happened, the challenges took place in terms of trying to get the machines onto the grid. That started at 1:30 p.m. yesterday, and our control engineers at the control center was making every effort, and all the interaction was taking place. We deployed all our staff, our technical staff, to every substation. So we did all that we had to do. We dispatched all our technical staff to almost every substation in the event that you had issues that you had to do switching. Beyond that, it was only until 10 to 7 last night that we were able to get some degree of capacity in a stable mode at the Penal power station. That is bringing up unit number 6 and unit number 8 at the Penal power station. That allowed us to bring supply to the other interface, other generating stations, and allowed us to continue to slowly add back that capacity to the grid. And let me just explain something. If it is that you are running a generating station and you totally lose power, the only way you can restore back power is you have to find some source of supply to run the pumps and the other auxiliary units of those machines to bring back power. And each of the various IPPs are required to have what you call black start units, that if you have an outage, that they could come on via those units. That also poses a little challenge also, of which will be the subject of a further investigation. Having said that, as I said, at 10 to 7, we were able to restore, in terms of some degree of stability at 10 to 7 yesterday afternoon. As time went by, customers gradually was restored, service was gradually restored. Bear in mind how the grid is connected. All the capacity on the grid, the way this country, Trinidad, Tobago was not affected. Tobago was supplied via the Cove power station, and they were not affected. If you look at the country and you slice it in half, all the capacity in this country in terms of generation capacity is on the lower half of this country, right, from central to south. And therefore, you now have to deal with bringing that capacity up on the grid. And to do that, you have to be careful in terms of your voltages, in terms of how you actually restore capacity as you go up on the grid. So that also, while we were aware of that, really if we had sorted out this response, we probably might have been probably within an hour, we might have been able to restore service. Unfortunately, service to the entire country was only resolved until 1:30 this morning. The minister was quite correct. Our line minister was there at the Mount Hope Control Center, stayed with us, we worked together, right? And at 1:30, we restored all our customers in Trinidad at approximately 1:30 a.m. this morning.
Thank you. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks a lot.
Ladies and gentlemen, when the news came yesterday, as you will recall, the first indication that we got, national security that is, was that this problem should be resolved within 2.5 to 3 hours. I was at office, I was in the company of the Chief of Defense Staff, and I was in contact with the Commissioner of Police. And we had assessed the situation. I observed from where I was, thousands of vehicles traversing Ryson Road, and it suggested to me, in addition to the reports I was getting from the police and other reports, that offices now without air conditioning and all that, heating up, darkness in stores and that sort of thing, people were making their way out of the city centers around the country, and heading generally, I rather suspect, for home. And by about 6:15, I observed that Ryson Road was pretty clean. It means that kind of movement had slowed down. I assessed that to mean, and I'm no expert, but I assessed that to mean that those who would use it had already made their way through and the thing was happening. I was aware that the police commissioner, and he'll detail on this in a little while, had put police officers out there to make sure that the traffic is properly regulated to avoid the bottlenecking and the things that could flow from that. But when nightfall started to come by about 6 and so on, we realized that the thing didn't yet come up. It was then, well, we were contemplating it all along, but now national security issues came really to the fore. And of course, this having happened at around 1 p.m., it allowed people during daylight hours to traverse the roadways and to get out of their offices and their business places and so on. And as I said, you know, I recalled in 2004, you had a blackout situation in London and there was mass looting, and it happened in New York sometime after that as well. And these things loomed large in my own mind. And therefore, I ensured that the police commissioner and the chief of defense staff do what they as experts had to do to ensure that whatever was forthcoming as a result of the darkness of night in the context of this crisis that we had, it would be well managed. In this circumstance, I would like to introduce Mr. Jacob to tell us about the action of the police, and just following him, the chief of defense staff, and then we'll resume from the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister of National Security, Mr. Hinds, and to all of viewers and listenership at this point in time. Yesterday, when we got the information and we realized what was happening, it was very, very simple for us to implement our emergency traffic plan in the evening period. We, in fact, cause our traffic and highway patrol and our emergency response team to be located by the main junctions, intersections, to cause traffic to flow from the capital city and other locations very smoothly. Yes, there were some challenges, but I wish to thank a lot of the law-abiding citizens who cooperated with the police, because as you're aware, several of these traffic lights were out. So we had to place officers to conduct traffic duties at these traffic lights. I wish to thank the officers. In some instances, some of them extended themselves in the context of some officers supposed to finish work at 4 in the evening, and they continued working. The Deputy Commissioner, who is sitting next to me, Ms. Christopher, in charge of operations, she had organized and was preparing for in case the blackout continued during the evening into the night. And when we got the information, we in fact, again, kicked in another emergency planning where we paid special attention to all the main shopping areas, malls, city centers, and housing areas. But we didn't do this alone. We had a joint approach with our Defense Force personnel and partners, the municipal police, the transit police. We all merged together, and from an incident coordinating arrangement, everything was coordinated well. But what was very, very important for us is paying attention to all the installations and major infrastructure, government buildings, and the main housing areas throughout Trinidad and Tobago. Our exercise, we deem it as being successful, even though we had 2 incidents that we aligned it to what happened on last night with the blackout. We had a situation at the PTSC compound where a few young men invaded that compound, about 6 of them, and there was some encounter with a security officer, and one of them was shot dead. That matter is under investigation. And then we had another situation off the Beetham Highway, where unfortunately the Police Social and Welfare Association service station was broken into and a vault was taken. And those were the only 2 incidents that we aligned to the situation that occurred. Yes, there were other situations that occurred in other divisions, but there was no correlation to the blackout. So again, with the help of the Defense Force, where we had set up our operational center, we managed things, and there were a lot of coordination and communication through our communication system, because we knew that the normal cell phones and other things, there were some difficulties. And as everything ended, even though we talk about 1:30 a.m., we continue our vigilance throughout the night. I want to thank all the police officers, Defense Force officers, and others. The police officers, most of them who are supposed to finish work at 6 p.m. in the evening and 7 p.m., they were detailed to continue working through that evening and into the morning. And they did so with the relevant support that we require. They were highly motivated. So we thank the officers and the support that we got from all the other agencies, especially the Defense Force, dealing with this situation. We have learned from it, and I want to give the population the assurance that we are prepared for any such eventuality again. Thank you.
Chief of Defense Staff.
Yeah.
Honorable Ministers, Permanent Secretaries, Acting Commissioner of Police and Deputy Commissioner, Mr. Ramsook, other members of T&TEC, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, listening public, good afternoon. As highlighted by the Acting Commissioner, the Defense Force would have been on standby to support the police in terms of elements we would have had in our camps, depending on the feedback from the operational commanders on the ground. For example, in IATF, patrols would have gone out as usual, and based on the feedback from them, we would have boosted additional patrols to address any incidents. And thankfully, because of the public cooperation, there weren't any incidents that we had to respond to. In addition to having that standby element, the engineer division of the Defense Force would have been on standby to support additional fuel supply to, you'd appreciate, the hospitals which would have gone on generator supply. So if that became a need, we are on standby to make sure that those generators would not have run out of fuel and cause the impending issues that will arrive from that issue. We would have been on standby up until this morning to make sure that we were available for if there was any need for a surge in operations to address any impending issues. It highlighted some shortcomings that in terms of communications, because we all have realized challenges with the phones and so on, and things will be put in place to make sure that if that happens in the future, we are in a better position to deal with it. As in all operations, you analyze what went well, what didn't go well, so that if such occurrences happen again, you will be better at it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me invite Minister Young to bring a perspective from the Office of the Prime Minister again, because as he indicated earlier, at all stages through this, we communicated at the level of the National Security Council, and most particularly with the Honorable Prime Minister, Minister Young.
Thank you very much. At all times, when this incident began until its resolution, even after the 1:30 return of a full grid of electricity to Trinidad, the government was concerned. There were certain things that you just could not predict. We kept getting fed with the best information at the time, not only from T&TEC but also from the independent power producers. And still, due to the incidents that Mr. Ramsook detailed, they were unable to provide us with definitive times. This event has clearly demonstrated, I think, to the population at large and in particular to us at the government level, that there are vulnerabilities. There are vulnerabilities in the power generation and distribution. There's a breakdown and disruption in the communication system we saw yesterday as a result of what took place. That's been referenced by our national security heads. And then also there's always room for improvement. And that is something that the government recognized immediately. And we began discussions yesterday as to what needed to happen immediately thereafter. As I said, there was an emergency National Security Council this morning, just before we held our weekly cabinet meeting, both chaired by the Honorable Prime Minister. And a decision was taken at the National Security Council as follows, that there will be a proposal to Cabinet, and we expect Cabinet to agree to it, adopt it, and to go forward with it for an in-depth, independent investigation. We will put together a small team of independent experts, both with respect to the power generation and distribution side. This is independent of the power producers, that is Trinity, PowerGen, TGU, and the distributor, T&TEC, as well as on the national security side, because as you all recognize and as we've heard, the importance of national security in these events is critical. So there will be a cabinet-appointed small investigative independent body to do a very in-depth dive into this, to look at what happened and to come up, most importantly, with recommendations to the cabinet for our consideration to both prevent any future occurrence of this type, as well as to ensure that we build out capacity and a redundancy in our power grid system that spreads and mitigates against risk, spreads the event of risk and mitigates against the risk. So we are going to have this done very shortly, within the shortest possible time frame. I can tell you all, from a Ministry of Energy perspective, there was absolutely no issue in relation to the supply of gas. A number of members of the media have asked that question. I couldn't answer it before because we just needed to get the job done. There was no gas supply, unlike what happened in 2013, which is when there was the last shutdown of the full grid, and that was due to natural gas supply issues. Minister Gonzales and myself have already begun discussions. We will be using the National Energy Company to do certain studies. We're pulling together things. We had already begun the work to look at certain options and to present those options to Cabinet. That will now tie into this investigative team that is going to be tasked with looking at it and coming up with recommendations. So we're looking forward to that. Of course, the timeline has not yet been decided, but we do know it has to happen as urgently as possible. We need to identify the persons, which will be done shortly. And of course, you, the members of the public, through the media, would be notified as soon as that is done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And from our perspective, again, in national security, it appears that we were able to avert some of the worst excesses of that which can have occurred in a situation of a national blackout. I gave two examples in passing a while ago. So for that, we too are thankful. We too are very thankful to the people of Trinidad and Tobago who, for the most part, conducted themselves, as usual, civilly and with social awareness, and proceeded safely to their places of abode. So much so that Mr. Jacob and the Chief of Defense Staff could report today that things were pretty calm. We would like to congratulate the public in that regard. We would also like to congratulate, and I would like to thank my colleague, Minister Gonzales, who led the people at T&TEC and who saw us from blackout to restoration of full service by 1:30, though for the reasons explained by Mr. Ramsook, it took a little more than expected. So I congratulate as well the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service thanking every one of the officers who went beyond the call yesterday in this national situation, and the members of the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force. And I'm not only saying this as Minister of National Security and, of course, a member of the government, but I too had an opportunity to see some of the commentary in the mainstream media this morning. And more than that, I had the opportunity to peruse some elements of social media which speaks very loudly today. And I saw an outpouring of commendation for the police in particular in respect of their management of the affairs. So I think I can say, notwithstanding the crisis that beset us yesterday, the situation was well policed, it was well soldiered, it was generally well managed, and we are more than thankful for that. I look forward to the outpourings of the in-depth analyses that the Prime Minister has suggested that should come on, because there are lessons to be learnt, and we are keen to learn them to prevent, as Minister Young said, and to perfect the way we should respond to these events. Public wouldn't know, but it provides an opportunity for terrorists. It provides an opportunity for extreme social disorder, and we were able to avoid and avert some of that last evening, and we are more than grateful. So we hope that we have collectively answered your concerns and your questions, but to the extent that we have not, we are now all in your hands and available for any questions that you as members of the media would have by way of elucidation on the matters we have raised. Thank you.
If I just had to get a gently
and of course,
nudge
thank
the
you,
ball.
Mr. Douglas. You can direct a question to any one of the
To
personnel
anybody.
who are reporting to you today.
There was some murmuring in the public sphere about whether the government had kept people informed. Well, if there was some delay in the government keeping people abreast of what had happened. So do you want to say what the timeline would have been, whether this was through the agency of T&TEC or through the central government, of like when notifications were given out, please?
So, Mr. Douglas, as I said very clearly in my initial conversation, the decision was taken very early o'clock to have T&TEC manage, because they were the ones who were best suited to manage the provision of information with respect to what was going on. There was nobody better suited. Also, the Minister of Public Utilities did provide information along the way. One of the things we learned coming out of yesterday with that type of situation, where you have a collapse of the whole power generation and distribution grid, is that we need to look at the communication side as well. So when I talked about communication, it's not only the phone communication, but how the messages are gotten out. Because at the time, the phone lines went down, the landlines. At the time, some persons would not have had. For example, I didn't have any opportunity to be looking at a television because you had no electricity. So you relied on social media. We then said, and I remember having a conversation with Mr. Ramsook and Minister Gonzales yesterday, let us use the radio station. So there is room for improvement. We do recognize it, but one of the things you do in a crisis like this is there should be one source of information and not information coming from all over. And that decision was taken for T&TEC to put out that information yesterday.
Yes?
Minister, I just want to make a comment.
Thank you.
So I feel I should make a comment on this again. One of the key things that occurred from the moment the line minister was informed, I can give you that assurance, he immediately directed that the commission immediately go on the media and notify the media in whatever way we could, given that we had this outage and that we would have had to look at what was available. Ms. Brasnell, who is at the back, I know she was in charge with that responsibility, and I know that she discharged that responsibility. And every discussion that I held with the media, with the Minister Gonzales at the time, during yesterday afternoon, he reiterated the notification of the public. That was a clear directive that I received.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joel Nanton. Jewel Brown, sorry. Jewel Brown.
Jewel Brown, TV6.
Jewel Brown.
Just wondering, to Minister Gonzales, in terms of the telecommunications issue, where there was that problem where they could not, for example, for a while there was no data and things like that, phone calls were difficult to have gotten done at a particular point in time. Did you get any reports from the relevant telecommunication providers as well in terms of the challenges they faced, and also any update in terms of water supply today?
Right. So let me first respond to the TSTT challenges. Some of TSTT's network and their generators, their mobile phone transmitters, they operate by generators that has the capacity to keep those generators online for 6 hours. Some of the generators, or rather transmitters, can stay on stream for 4 hours because they are battery powered. Unfortunately, because of the extent of the outage, a lot of the transmitters went out of service, causing a disruption in the telecommunication services to a number of customers across Trinidad and Tobago. So customers did in fact experience a disruption in their service, but by and large, most of the transmitters remain in effect, despite the fact that they would have moved over their 6-hour capacity. As of this morning, most of them came back into operation, and TSTT has advised that their field operators are out there conducting further audit to ensure that all of the transmitters are back into operation. With respect to WASA, this morning by 6 or 7 a.m., 70% of WASA's plants, their booster stations, as well as some of their main transmission points, they came back into operation. However, with respect to some of the communities that live or occupy some of the higher elevated area that rely on boosted water to get to these elevated points, they would have to take a little longer for the pressure to build up so that water can get on the elevated points. But for communities that are on the lower lying areas, they would have started experiencing a normalization of their water supply. I was also informed that one of the desal plants did not come into operation. That is at 7 Seas in Point Fortin. The desal plant at Point Lisas, they were producing water this morning to the tune of about 5 million gallons of water per day. So things did not normalize as we expected at the desal plants, but I am hoping that by the end of today, the desal court will go back up and ramp up their production to 40 million gallons of water per day, and the 7 Seas plant can get back into operation, and their capacity is about 5 million gallons of water per day. But as the system continues to be charged, communities, especially on the elevated points, will start seeing an improvement in their supplies.
Given the explanation in terms of what would have occurred yesterday, I'm also wondering, with the decommissioning of the power plant in Port of Spain, would that be putting any additional burden on the independent power providers in terms of taking over whatever that capacity would have been in Port of Spain?
I don't think it will put any additional burden, or it's putting any additional burden. What it has done is expose a vulnerability in the system, because most of the electricity generation is taking place in central and south region. And as Mr. Ramsook explained a short while ago, you have to build up the system incrementally before the power can get back into Port of Spain in the west and some parts of the east-west corridor. So it has exposed a certain vulnerability in the system. It's not the best way in which you design an electrical grid. But at the appropriate time, as Minister Young indicated a short while ago, we will await the outcome of the investigation. And once we have that report in hand, we will be approaching Cabinet with certain recommendations to ensure that we build back some kind of capacity within the Port of Spain area to prevent that kind of widespread outage that went on yesterday.
And just to add to that, Jewel, because Minister Gonzales wouldn't have been with us in the 2015 to 2020. We came in as an administration in 2015, and one of the first things we discovered was a decision that had been taken to decommission the plant, power generation plant on Ryson Road. At the time, we immediately recognized some of the difficulties that may pose, and that is why we had begun the type of studies that I've referred to, but I can't get into the detail along the lines of what Minister Gonzales has just referred to. So we are already some way ahead in terms of identifying, and we're looking at the state-of-the-art technology, and then to put on the energy hat as well, greener, cleaner power generation techniques and technology that exists now, and looking at that for addition to the grid.
I was just wondering if that capacity for Port of Spain that you're looking at, if at any point or whenever it is established, would it be at the site where the power plant was in Port of Spain or another location?
Another location.
Hi, good afternoon. Renuka Singh at the Trinidad Guardian. My question is for Mr. Ramsook. I understand that you're saying, and thank you so much for that comprehensive overview of what occurred. I understand you're saying that the cause of the fault, or whatever is the fault, is still being investigated. But could you say whether it looks like human error, failure of equipment, interference? You could give any details on what would have triggered that issue?
I would prefer not to comment on that part unless that investigation is completed. You know, sometimes when you are dealing with issues, certain things show up and then you realize it may not be that aspect of things. This is a matter that affected the entire country, so I'd rather let the committee conduct the full investigation and provide a report. And I know Honorable Minister Gonzales is looking at that also with the committee.
Let me say that a preliminary report was presented to the Prime Minister. It was passed through me from Mr. Ramsook, and it was presented to the Prime Minister. It is quite evident, it is quite clear that there was no sabotage or nothing from a human perspective that would have resulted in that disruption that took place yesterday. So I want to make it abundantly clear.
Yes? Members of the media, any further question?
To you, Minister Hinds, in terms of the national security response, and we heard the reporting from the Chief of Defence Staff and the Acting Police Commissioner, are there any areas specifically that you would like to see, or do you think that could have been done in a better way, or you're generally satisfied with the overall response as was yesterday?
As I indicated a while ago, we did not experience some of the worst excesses of that which was possible arising out of a national blackout, as we have seen in other countries' experiences. In that regard, I am quite happy, quite satisfied. I'm aware of the actions that were taken by the police and the defense force, some outlined by Mr. Jacob, and for that I am quite happy. But you would have heard that the situation yielded so much potential for so much to have gone wrong. While I am thankful that it never got to that extent, I am more than grateful that we, quite sensibly, on the direction of the Prime Minister, would have an independent look at the situation to determine, in all of the circumstances, whether there is a need to do other things and to do more in order to better prepare ourselves for future eventualities. You're more than welcome. Independent,
are these persons who would be persons from Trinidad and Tobago? Is it possible they could be persons from outside of Trinidad and Tobago?
When I say independent, I mean independent of national security, of the Ministry of Public Utilities. Persons with expertise and with national, with a spirit of patriotism, who want good for Trinidad and Tobago, they would have a look at it outside of us and say what the situation might better be.
So Jewel, as I said a short while ago, the composition of the The team, is all we know at this stage is we're looking for independent experts in those two areas, but we are certainly not confining ourselves to any nationality at this stage.
And also, in terms of assurances to the public, given that the system is backed up, but that there would not be necessarily any repeat of anything like what happened yesterday in the very near future at the very least.
I think when I took my oath of appointment, I would have liked to assure the country that something of this nature would have never happened, especially under my tenure. So these things you can't, and I'm sure the Commissioner of Police I'm referring to would wish to assure the country that tomorrow wouldn't have a murder. But these things are all dwell in our heart, and we wish only the best for Trinidad and Tobago. But there are things that are completely outside of our control. But what I can assure you, Joel, is that we have a group of professionals in our institutions, be it in the police service, be it in the defense force, and in this case in T&TEC, who are committed to the task and are willing and are ready to respond to any emergency that may present itself.
Your two questions having been met, we would like to thank all of you members of the media. You have another? Yes? Thank you.
Nas from Loop News. This is a bit of a segue, Minister Gonzales. From the perspective of being able, some people thought that perhaps they could avail themselves of solar-powered sources to be a bit more independent. Currently, I'm aware that the tax rebate is only for solar-powered water heaters. There are as yet no solar tariffs. Are there any plans to perhaps develop a system or pave the way for homes to be a bit more independent via solar-powered energy?
Yes, so the Ministry of Public Utilities will be presenting to Cabinet, and that has nothing to do with what transpired yesterday. But we will be looking to present to Cabinet a policy to amend the Trinidad and Tobago Electricity Commissions Act to allow for domestic customers to install their own solar system on their homes in order to generate, their own source of electricity as opposed to depending on T&TEC national grid. It's all about generating electricity, and therefore it impacts on the Trinidad and Tobago Commissions Act insofar as it relates to the generation of electricity. So this requires an amendment to the current T&TEC Act, and we intend to, as part of the thrust of the government, to introduce more renewable power. In the way that we do business, we intend to present to Cabinet a policy to amend the Act for this thing to happen.
Mr. Douglas, we, in the spirit of transparency and accountability, having had an emergency National Security Council meeting earlier today, followed immediately by our cabinet, which finished maybe about an hour and a half or so ago. Is it? Yeah. Yes. We opted as a government to present ourselves here today before you, the people of Trinidad and Tobago, to take and answer your questions in respect of the matters that transpired over the last 24, 26, 27 hours. So we have done so, we hope, to your great joy and satisfaction. We are not averse to taking other questions, but I would be happy to take them at another occasion, in another forum. I wanted to confine this to satisfying the Trinidad and Tobago people on the events of the last 27 hours, and we trust that we have done so. I'd be quite happy to talk to you otherwise. More than welcome.
Okay,
thank you all very much, ladies and gentlemen. Was it somebody else? Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Right. Good afternoon, Cameron Fletcher, Trinidad Express. So, taking your own words in the spirit of transparency, we know that the question is still left unanswered as far as the nature of the original fall that was mentioned by Mr. Ramsook. So, therefore, because he said that that will be discussed when there is the official investigation. But as
I'm
far
sorry, the nature of what?
the fault, the original fault.
I think
No,
Mr. Ramsook explained
he
it
explained in
as
great detail.
far as he can at this stage. At the end of the day, they are the technical people. They've looked at it. We do not want to prejudice any investigation that we intend to take place, etc. There's absolutely nothing to hide. So at the
unexplained.
appropriate time, once the independent people have investigated and looked at it, what we wanted to give, and I think Minister Gonzales gave it, the assurance is at this stage on his preliminary reports, they see no evidence of any sabotage. But let's leave that right now because, as we said, a decision has been taken to appoint an independent team to investigate it.
All right, okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, we would like to thank you all very much. Travel safely back to your respective workstations. Good luck and God bless you. Thank you.
TDT News. Committed. Accurate. Relevant.
The winning numbers in the National Lottery online draws for Wednesday, 16th February 2022. At 10